to the presidency of Hellenic College and Holy Cross by Father Stavros και κατά σύμπτωση, I'm going to introduce him at the same time. I guess it just works together. I just want to do μια παρένθεση. I'm the only thing that's stopping us from coffee, so I understand that. Πρέπει να πάμε μπροστά, αλλά να κάνουμε και σωστές ερωτήσεις μετά που θα μιλήσει ο Πάτερ.
So we need to forge ahead along with the Q&A.
And tell them how proud I am that they're here. Some of them are some of your speakers. So that makes us feel comfortable as parents of tremendous, not only hierarchs, priests, but also lay people as well. So it's an honor to be here. Today we have the privilege of hearing someone that we know very well. We don't have a big introduction for Father Stavros. He is a Protopres, as we know, the coordinator.
Για τον Πατέρα Σταύρο, τον ξέρουμε ως συντονιστή του δικτύου του Οικουμενικού Πατριαρχείου για την Πνευματική Διακονία στον χώρο της υγείας. Θα μιλήσει για την μοναξιά στη ζωή και την ασθένεια. Ένα καλωσόρισμα στον Πατέρα Σταύρο.
Step of my life, Holy Cross has been with me.
Θα ήθελα να πω ότι η Σχολή του Τιμίου Σταυρού είναι μαζί μου και παραμένει μαζί μου σε κάθε μου βήμα, και το δίκτυο του Οικουμενικού Πατριαρχείου για την Πνευματική Διακονία στον χώρο της υγείας θέλει να συνδεθεί ακόμη στενότερα.
Συντονιστή του.
Let me switch to Greek and let me first complain to the moderator of the Pastoral Healthcare Network for curtailing the time given to speakers. Let's recall Father Nectarios, who at a conference in the Vatican, there was a speaker there who had established the corresponding network there, a cardinal. He spoke for an hour and a half and then said, "Someone removed 5 pages from my paper." The Greek Red Cross Hospital in 1976 is the setting. The dialysis unit in the hospital consisted of 8 patients, a head surgeon, a urologist, a matron, a nurse, and an orderly. They all experienced their own loneliness and their own pain. The matron had to go back home to her 2 autistic children. The young nurse had just divorced a little after having been married and had to take care of her child. The orderly had to go back to her aged mother, who was bedridden. The head surgeon had a graceless, probably non-existent marriage and a very difficult son in adolescence, and each of the patients beyond her condition had to cope with various circumstances in the familiar environment and more widely. As I was cognizant of most of the aspects of their lives, the patients didn't talk much to me, and they preferred me to sit by their side silently as in communion with their loneliness. The dialysis unit that I had been visiting, just like any small group or society, is a microcosm of the society at large in which we exist. This microcosm is a bit like a sea, and our societies, small islands, dispersed over it. From far away, an island doesn't look as if it's too distant from any other, but it's not true. Actually, access to an island can be rather difficult, especially in bad weather. Each island is separate, distinct, with its own shape, its own beauty, its own difficulties, its own comportment, and its own needs. On each island, there are people that live alone, like the reefs amidst the waters, the world, a widening sea. And they, mute and bent and lonely, wind-beaten reefs, solitary people, like sticks all broken up, like derelict chapels, like you and like me. Like you and like me. The weak nature of man constitutes a common identity for all of us, but each is a unique and unrepeatable existence experiencing their onlyness and therefore their loneliness. Apparently, we live close to one another, but in fact, there is an existential distance between us, and oftentimes it is difficult to achieve substantial communication with other people. Each person is endowed with their own beauty, their own imperfections, joys, sorrows, and situations with which they must come to grips. The question is, therefore, how much loneliness does one experience when all those different situations arise in their lives? No matter how much they'd like to avoid them, they have to come to grips with them, to stare them in the eye, to deal with them in their loneliness. The definition of the word loneliness in Greek and foreign dictionaries is a situation of a human being that lives alone, in isolation from other people. Island isolation, without communication, contact with other people. But to be lonely is something beyond temporary experience or affect or group of feelings. Loneliness is a perennial predicament that includes all of man's fallen nature, his post-lapsarian nature. On the one hand, we want to avoid it, and on the other hand, we want to preserve it. Loneliness is experienced in a very deep, obscure part of ourselves in three different ways. The first way is through the ontological anxiety of death, namely that we shall cease to exist as circumscribed beings that live in the freedom of love. Our struggle in life is to preserve a human hypostasis given to us by the Maker. This hypostasis consists in the freedom each has to live alone and free as an image of God, so as to valorize the capability of loving and being loved. When our hypostasis is threatened, we feel undefended, defenseless before the surrounding dangers, and we fear for our existence. The more those dangers loom large, the more we fear losing our being, and that as persons and as lonelinesses. Along with this fear, there is this internal frustration, helplessness, the rage that creates an inner darkness. There is a dark daze in everything. We feel that everything requires much effort and striving. We cannot describe our worries. Our loneliness and fear absorb us so much that we cannot discern. We don't know whether what we see or what we hear, we see and hear rightly. And we don't even have the courage to pray. That is when we would cry up to God, my God, unto what have you forsaken me? Ontological fear, the existential threat, the feeling of frustration and of mental strain is particularly felt when we fall sick, when our physical and spiritual strength has abandoned us, and when pain has absorbed us and cut us off from the life in God. I recall my brotherly friend, Manolis Grazia, many of us remember him too, who died of pancreatic cancer, who little before dying wrote to me, what I did with life, my life I did with Christ. Where is he now? So that at least he might recall what we did together in this life for his eternal kingdom. I know he's somewhere over there, but I don't have the strength or the courage to pray and to speak to him. Very often I feel alone. What gives me some comfort is when I know that there are others who are praying to him for me, for my sake. Also, I remember Dimitris, 29 years old, who visited me when he was diagnosed with cancer in the abdomen. He was scared and didn't want to follow the treatment prescribed by the doctor. In tears, the only thing he would say would be, I'm afraid, I feel lonely, I'm in pain. I asked him, where are you feeling the pain? And he said, I feel lonely. I feel pain deep inside me. I cannot bear the pain of loneliness. I am afraid. What was it that Dimitris was afraid of? What was his loneliness? What was his fear? At first sight, one might imagine that his reaction was excessive and unjustifiable. He had people at his side who gave all kinds of support, but he felt different to other people. Others were healthy. He was sick. Until that time, the likelihood of death did not touch him, and all of a sudden, death was close to him and jeopardized every present and future plan. Apologies. Now that he is seriously ill, he wouldn't be the one he had been, attractive, creative, pleasant, comely, what he believed he ought to be. And that was the reason why he feared that he would not be acceptable, that he would lose the love, the caring, the attention of his kin and his dearest friends. The moment he fell sick, he grew conscious of the tough reality of finite human nature. He didn't enjoy the privilege of exempting himself from it. Suddenly he found himself in an unknown path which he had to follow in the midst of the shadow of death. Dimitris felt that no one else would feel his agony and his pain the way he would. The truth is that as common as a pain and fear of death may be, they are at the same time the most personal and profound events in the life of any human being. The greatest anxiety, worry, is to a degree that pain and death has to be gone through on one's own. The experiential, existential crisis brought about by death is not related only to what we have to face in the future. It has to do also with what we have been through. Leah, who had been diagnosed with cancer, told me after her mastectomy that with her illness, what came to the fore was the loneliness she had been experiencing all the years past when she had been healthy. The head surgeon of the dialysis unit, having consideration for the likelihood of death, every day in front of him felt disturbed as he saw the sick, because he felt that he had lived an awful life himself, just like Ivan Ilyich. Tolstoy's Ivan Ilyich, who had led an awful and lonely death, who had had an awful and lonely death because he lived an awful life. The second way to experience loneliness is through our responsibility in life for ourselves and for others. Now, responsibility and accountability has several concepts behind it: being a responsible citizen, family man, show good behavior, be morally upright, be trustworthy, and existentially being authentic, well-defined, genuine, true, real, and to be definitive in your decisions and to bear the burden of your acts and your failures, and to make use of the freedom granted you by God to cultivate loving relations. Such a person with such responsibility is disposed to transcend himself, to carry the cross and follow the life that really is. At the pool of Siloam, the sin of the paralyzed person was his unwillingness to overcome the circumstances of his life. Immersed and settled comfortably in his helplessness, he couldn't see the people around him. When Christ asked him whether he wanted to be healthy, he didn't say yes. He preferred to make excuses and to put the blame for his degradation elsewhere. Christ removed his sin and cured him, and commanded him to take up his burden and walk through life as an authentic being, responsibly. When one lives as an authentic being, one recognizes the experiential knowledge that humanity has acquired through the centuries. The tragedy of present-day man is that in the name of an irresponsible misrepresentation of the concept of liberty that gives rise to desperation, hatred, and a huge, vast existential void, man has neglected his historical past and overlooked it, and with it the fundamental values of a person. Thus, as a mortal being without historical past or values, present-day man must resolve to live as if he were to live forever. But this is impossible, and therefore leads to utter insecurity, anxiety, and despair, and therefore to utter existential loneliness. Not being able to contend with such loneliness, he prefers to put away responsibility for himself and to enslave himself to pseudo-authorities, rulers and powers that exploit his insecurity to their own interest, creating, instead of associations of persons, masses of individuals that allow each to live alone in a misbegotten freedom, a misconstrued liberty in an anonymity without identity. Living in anonymity and unsociability without authenticity, a man is severed and separated from his fellow human being. And this means he is severed from his own self. This is the third way in which loneliness is experienced. This is the widespread spiritual mental state that characterizes present-day human beings. They live in emptiness, cut off from themselves. They don't know who they are themselves, who the others are, and for that reason they do not live in the all-embracing unity with God. His mind functions separately from his heart and volition. He says one thing and feels something that's totally different. On the one hand, he has no idea what he wants and therefore can make no choice, and on the other hand, he would like to have everything. To make up for his loneliness and existential void, he would create temporary, mainly sexual relationships without any limits, and poses unrealistic expectations for those relations so that they can be stifling and serve as an obstacle in their development. In the words of T.S. Eliot, man has become a shape without form, shade without color, paralyzed force, gesture without motion. The only thing thus achieved is to strengthen a sense of frustration and vanity and disappointment. It's no paradox, therefore, that young people are very diffident before the prospect of marriage, that divorces are on the rise, that we have become consumers, and that there is this widespread despair over the future. At this fourth conference of the Ecumenical Patriarchate, the Mother Church is calling on us to contend with loneliness in a spirit of hope. But for this to be achieved, we need to acknowledge and to accept that as long as we are living in this world, we shall never be fully relieved of our loneliness. So long as we continue to repudiate this truth, the more we shall be brought down by loneliness. And that is the reason we shouldn't try to cover up our loneliness with empty words, and especially the loneliness of those who come to find comfort. We must not forget that Christ lived alone, that he had nowhere to lay his head, and that we hid our faces from him. He was despised, and we did not esteem him. He was alone in the desert, where his existential hypothesis was put to the test. Before his crucifixion, his disciples left him alone, but he was not alone, because he was with his Father. As members of the Church, we are invited to remain in the world that crucified Christ, but not to draw distant from his love. To the degree that we repudiate the Catholicity of his love, the all-embracing character of his love, we shall continue being cut off and isolated from God and from our fellow human being and from ourselves. The presence of loneliness in our life is a challenge to our faith, and at the same time an indication of the degree to which we believe that Christ will not abandon us but will remain with us forever. The increase in a feeling of loneliness in our day needs to cause us some concern. Do we not, as members of the Church, hold a share of the responsibility for it because we avoid to accept our loneliness? Have we perhaps failed to acquire the necessary awareness of ourselves so that we might know when and how our ontological standing is put to the test? Could it be that we fail to discern when our soul is perturbed by misfortunes and temptations which cover our hearts with clouds, and we cannot discern what it is we see and hear? Might it not be that we cannot regard the other because we are afraid of regarding our own weaknesses? Is it possible that we are not authentic, genuine, real, and well-defined persons and prefer to put forward mask, pseudo authority by putting on our professional attire, our credentials, and our doctrinaire behavior? Do we perhaps fail to express our love freely because we are afraid of the responsibility that arises from such a relationship? Is it perhaps a lack of trust between ourselves because we don't put trust in ourselves? Are we perhaps lost in jealousy and envy and antagonism? Is it perhaps that we put up our own world because we are afraid to have due regard for the reality around us, because we don't want to participate in the common struggle to establish relations of communion in life? Are we perhaps not the fishermen of human beings because we do not create associations of persons where everyone could exist as a free being in the bond of peace and love? Could it be that our relation with God is determined by fear rather than love and established on the various dictates, you have to do this, you have to do that, which at the end of the day wrest away our genuineness, our liberty, freedom, ability to love our fellow human being and look for God through a good faithlessness. If all this is true, then we will prove insufficient. We will not have the needful faith and hope at the time of loneliness. We shall be marginalized, unwanted, and isolated. In my 45 years as a clergyman, I have lived many hours, days, nights of loneliness, but the relations I have forged through this patriarchal network and conference, and your presence at the conference, and the hope that those fraternal relations will be cultivated in the future, make my isolation and loneliness sweeter in my heart. And for this I thank you.